we're going to hand over now to Vaishnavi, who is our first panelist. So I'll just introduce Vaishnavi. She's a filmmaker, and she is the Women's Declaration International Country Contact for India. She also made the fantastic film. She's made lots of great films, but Dysphoric, which many of us have watched, but if you haven't watched it, you should definitely watch it. Thank you so much for speaking to us today, and over to you, Vaishnavi.
So India, with a population of 1.4 billion, is the second largest country in the world and is right behind China. We have 28 states and 8 union territories, and we speak several hundreds of languages with several distinct dialects. India is extremely divided, first in the name of language, but also in the name of caste, religion, and region. This presentation is no way an exhaustive look at the subject, as there were countless women's movements that were made that never made it into history books. India is extremely hierarchical, so all the provisions discussed here must have an implicit understanding that women belonging to oppressed castes and indigenous tribes couldn't enjoy some of the rights while upper caste women could. Some of the provisions are so caste blind and have no access to several basic needs. Also, though there are numerous misogynistic practices in India, I'm focusing on ones that were resisted and challenged by women, and to a large extent brought the practice to either scrutiny or abolition. First, we will take a look at the practice of Devadasi system. Devadasi was a religious practice dating back to the 6th century in several parts of India. It is a practice in which women were married to a deity of the temple. Later, the illegitimate sexual exploitation of the Devadasis became a norm, where these young women were forced to be prostituted to the village heads, temple stakeholders, landowners, etc. The term Devadasi literally means God's servant, but they are known by different names in different areas. There is a term called Devar Adiyal in Tamil-speaking areas of South India. In common parlance of the language, calling a woman Tevadiya became a derogatory term, implying that she is a slut or a whore or something like that. But the word originally comes from the women that were trapped in the Devadasi system. The earliest recorded evidence of the existence of Devar Adiyal occurs in the 11th century inscription of Rajaraja Chola, who donated lands and houses to the dancers who performed services to the temple. There was a very unique case where adoption rights of Devadasi system was very different from the rest of the country. Devadasis were encouraged to adopt children from any caste and call themselves the child's mother. While this was not afforded to the women who were Devadasis, this practice was not done because the law cared about them in any way. It was one way to ensure that there is a long lineage of girl children who could be put back into the system of Devadasis. Interestingly, only female children born to daughters of Devadasis were put back into the system, and not female children born to sons of Devadasis. The children born to the sons of Devadasis were allowed to live a regular life, marry, get educated, etc., as a form of golden ticket out of the system. But a daughter's daughter had to go through rigorous training in performance, singing, dancing, largely disallowed from getting formal education. If there were 2 daughters, the mother could choose to send one to school, retain one for the system. Marriage rights. Though there were no law prohibiting them from marrying, there were restrictions about who they could marry. Along with the performers, there were also these instrumentalists, workers, and technicians, etc., who were part of their troupe. Devadasis were prevented from marrying men within the troupe. And men from the troupe, however, could marry the daughters of Devadasis' sons. So very convoluted sort of a hierarchical system within a misogynistic practice. We need to understand that this group was largely insular, and they were seen as an outcast. So it was not that the Devadasi woman would not want to marry outside, but she was not readily accepted as a wife by, say, an upper caste man or anyone else living in quote-unquote civilized society. There were 2 women who played a significant role in the abolition of this system. We will look at them individually now. Muwaloo Ramamritham, she was among one of the early social reformers and an important political figure who worked for women's rights all the way until the time of her death in 1962. Hailing from the community herself, Muwaloo pushed to bring an end to the Devadasi system by creating plays, writing, speaking on stage, lobbying with the politicians, speaking out about the harms that are done within the community. a quality not many women within the community dared to have. So within the Devadasi system, there was a higher status Devadasi, there were lower status Devadasis. So because higher status Devadasis bring with it a certain superficial privileges of being in the company of, say, wealthy men who offer marginal financial security, right to reap the harvest from a land but not own the land, and privilege of being decked with jewelry during performances and things like that. When Muwaloo tried to bring an end to the system, she faced a lot of resistance from the community itself because they thought she was depriving them. They thought she was depriving them of all the benefits that they were enjoying. Though the Devadasi abolition bill was brought about in 1947, the practice continues to this day. Another iconic woman within the Devadasi abolition movement is Dr. Muthulakshmi Reddy. Dr. Reddy was born to a Brahmin father and a mother from Isai Velalar community, as they call it, the Devadasi community itself. Contrary to social conventions, she was educated. She made her way to becoming the first woman house surgeon in the Madras Maternity Hospital. She married a man of her choice from a different caste at the age of 28. She was a strong force behind setting up the Avai Home for Orphan Girls. She set up the Adyar Cancer Institute and found ways to provide scholarship for Dalit girls and hostel for Muslim girls to pursue education. She actively worked against trafficking of women for sex work. Deeply concerned by the state of women in her community, she was particularly forceful in her argument to abolish the Devadasi system. In 1927, the Women's India Association nominated her to be the Madras Legislative Council as vice president. It was in this council that she brought the bill to abolish the Devadasi practice in 1930. Though it was rejected on that occasion, it brought attention to the practice, therefore alerting more policymakers to come forward and talk about it. Apart from these two incredible women, of course, there were several women who tirelessly worked towards the abolition of this misogynistic practice. While they successfully abolished it in law, it is unfortunate that our society has kept this practice thriving. We will now look at the practice of child marriage. A third of world's child brides are in India, according to a report from UNESCO. Child marriage causes high rates of maternal mortality, and one woman dies every 7 minutes in India because of pregnancy-related cause. And children are even more vulnerable to such dangers. Poverty is one of the main causes of child marriage, and more than half of the Indian population live below the poverty line with no money to afford a decent shelter or a proper meal. During such cases, a child is given away in exchange for some money, or if the family thinks it would get her some sort of a security. There was this one woman who was a strong force behind bringing this practice to the attention of the policymakers. Rukhma Bhai Rao was married at the age of 11. A child bride herself became a fierce advocate when she contested her husband's claim to conjugal rights in an iconic court case that led to the passage of Age of Consent Act in 1891. And this changed the age of consent from 10 to 12. And at that time, this was a big deal. The case against her was reopened and she was given two choices. Either she could live with her husband or spend 6 months in jail. She chose to go to jail rather than spending time with her husband. During this period, however, Raut had written a series of articles in various newspapers as an anonymous journalist, adopting a pseudonym. Rukhma Bai was born to a woman who herself was a victim of child marriage, who was married off at the age of 14 and gave birth to Rukhma Bai at the age of 15. And she also became a widow at 17. In 1929, after her retirement, she published a pamphlet called Parda, which means a veil, and the need for its abolition, arguing that young widows were being denied the chance of actively contributing in Indian society. Because if your husband is dead, even if you're a child who was married to an older man, you will be ostracized in the society and you have to wear a certain type of clothes that sort of makes you stand out and people can know that you are a child widow. But despite the best efforts of women who spend their whole life trying to bring legalities to safeguard children, this evil practice is just as rampant in modern India. In 2020, during lockdown, a 16-year-old girl called the authorities in South state of Tamil Nadu, and she filed a complaint against her parents. She claimed that she was being forced to marry a 39-year-old man, and she asked for help. The girl's parents had lost their jobs during the pandemic, and she had received this offer from a man who said he'd take care of all the wedding expenses, said he didn't even want dowry. So the parents were forced to consider it. But thankfully, because the little girl escalated the issue, the authorities could intervene and stop it. But the district of Tiruvannamalai, where this incident happened, claims that The second highest number of child marriage happens in that part of Tamil Nadu, which saw 168 such cases in 2019. And a report during the same year by UNICEF states that one in three of world's child brides live in India. And of the country's 223 million child brides, 102 million were married before turning 15. Now we will look at the practice of dowry. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. Basically, it's dowry is any property or valuable or security given or agreed to be given either directly or indirectly by the bride family to the grooms. The system incorporates payments in the form of capital, durable goods, vehicles, real estate, among others. But it is on the condition that the man would accept to marry the woman. This practice is followed across religion, caste, and class of people. It is prevalent in neighboring countries like Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh as well. The origin of dowry system in India is unclear, but it seems to have mentioned in the early scriptures as an acceptable form of transaction. During the pre-colonial times, it was followed as a matter of prestige, where the bride's family can flaunt their wealth or class status, and flamboyant weddings were considered a status symbol. Despite dowry-related violence, the practice went on undeterred. During colonial times, the practice became a norm, and post 1947, post our independence, it boomed because there was absolutely no checks and balance on it whatsoever. While there was some resistance in the post-independence period, all efforts to stop the practice had to take a back step because the authorities thought that the country was establishing itself after independence, so all focus should be on that. Some real agitation actually only took place in the 1970s, led by women's groups in various states of the country. Women took to streets demanding an end of dowry-based deaths and violence. Until then, death by fire, which is usually the most common way of killing a woman during such practice, was considered as suicide and a family matter, and authorities wouldn't intervene. Even when the victims lived long enough to incriminate the husband or the in-laws, the follow-up was so delayed or not thorough that in the end, those cases were registered as suicides after all. This was probably also because the law specifically meant for crimes related to dowry demands were not in place by then. However, even when the case was registered as murder, the testimony of the victim was considered as insufficient evidence. In 1961, which was about 11 years after the creation of Indian Constitution, the Parliament passed its first legislation against dowry, and in the form of an act called Dowry Prohibition Act, which criminalized demanding or giving dowry. This act was given significantly more teeth in amendments in 1984 and 86. The 1986 one especially added dowry deaths to the section 304 of the Indian Penal Code, which made dowry deaths as culpable homicides. In 1983, another section was added to the Penal Code, which further strengthened the anti-dowry provisions and obliged the police to arrest a woman's in-laws in case of harassment and or cruelty. It was a landmark achievement for women's rights in the country. According to this section, cruelty specifying both physical and mental harassment was seen as a non-bailable offense. Interestingly, what happened because of agitation about the dowry system is something called the Indian Evidence Act also came to be. If a man was contributing to violence, he could be punished on the basis of abetment to suicide. Lastly, there was also an important amendment of section 174 where criminal procedure code, which made it compulsory to do a post-mortem of the woman who died within 7 years of marriage under suspicious circumstances. So these achievements were brought about by the relentless advocacy by women's groups, common women who were out on the streets fighting tooth and nail for it. The earliest protests against dowry in the post-independence feminist movement were made by the Progressive Organization of Women in Hyderabad in 1975, with 2,000 people turning up at a venue and hold several demonstrations. Eradicating dowry was also an agenda of other women's movements like the Shahada movement of 1972. However, in 1977, the movement gained momentum because Delhi, the country's capital, joined in on the protest because that was where most of the dowry deaths were happening. I want to particularly bring your attention to this one amazing woman called Satyarani Chada, who you see in the bottom right of the presentation. She was a women's rights activist known for launching the anti-dowry movement in India. She embarked on this difficult journey of social and legal reformation in the 1980s, together with a fellow activist. And both of them lost their daughters to dowry disputes together. They spent decades campaigning for justice and to change the dowry practices in India. But Satyarani Chada passed away on 1st July 2014 and will always be remembered as a symbol of grit and resilience. Despite the advocacy that spanned their entire lives, dowry is just as rampant. Kerala, known to be a progressive state, and at the moment, if I may add, also considered as the wokest state of all of India, was in the news recently due to the suspicious deaths of 3 women continuously, all below the age of 25, and the cause of the death suspected to be violence because of dowry. And yet, Kerala prioritizes gender ideology at the moment. Now, I'll quickly run you through some of the rights and the women's movements that helped us achieve them. These are just give me goosebumps just thinking about it. We are only going to look at certain landmark achievements. There are several rights which have been achieved much later, even in modern times, because of women's groups and advocacy. But again, though these laws exist on paper, whether they're accessible, effective in actuality, warrants a different webinar in itself. We also need to understand that the laws in general are sometimes bundled, which makes the efficacy of one law subject to the efficacy of another. For example, reproductive integrity, for example, of a female who is married as a child is a conundrum because she should be ideally protected by both, but the legal system often drags it on for years debating which direction to proceed in. The women's suffrage movement in India first gathered momentum due to the female participation in the freedom struggle. Now, that again is an entirely deep topic that we could discuss another time, beginning with the Swadeshi movement in Bengal from 1905 to 1908, as well as with the support of the British suffragists, the voices of Indian suffragists were brought to the attention to the lawmakers and policymakers. There is so much that could be discussed about the Swadeshi movement alone, but this particular instance, I'm only sort of throwing in some glimmer. In 1919, there were so many pleas and reports indicating support for women to have the right of vote. There's something called the Indian Office, which is an office under British control that was considered to be dealing with all matters concerning India and India's policies or whatever. And before the Joint Select Committee of the House of Lords and Commons, they were meeting to actually finalize the electoral regulation reforms. At that time, Indian suffragists made a presentation about the need for voting rights. Though they were not granted voting rights nor the right to stand in election, the Government of India Act 1919 allowed provincial councils to determine if women could vote, provided they met certain stringent property, income, or educational levels. So not all women could vote at that time. Some women could vote if they owned properties, which was a clever way to categorize that because not a lot of women owned properties at that time. Different provinces of British India, therefore, extended limited suffrage rights to the women in the 1920s. The Government of India Act 1935 expanded women's suffrage and even provided reserved seats for women in central and provincial legislatures. For voting rights, full voting rights were awarded with the passing of the Indian Constitution in 1950, which provided for universal adult suffrage. The recognition of sexual and reproductive rights of women in the country still remains negligible. Reproductive rights in India are understood only in the context of selective issues like child marriage, female feticide, sex selection, abortion, menstrual health, and hygiene issues. This is reflected in election manifestos where several parties who promise to make certain provisions for women, like making registration of marriage compulsory or implementation of laws prohibiting child marriage, etc., providing reproductive menstrual health services to all women. They also promise to make marital rape illegal, which is still not yet. So those were just party promises that politicians made, but nothing came of it. Before 1971, abortion was criminalized under Section 312 of the Indian Penal Code. Actually, it could be, it was described as intentionally causing miscarriage, except in cases where abortion was carried out to save lives of the woman, or it was a punishable, or it was a case of minor or certain very unique cases like that. Until that time, it was a punishable offense and it criminalized the women as well as the service providers. However regressive all those things seem to be, unsafe abortions are the third leading cause of maternal deaths in India. Researchers have shown that half the pregnancies in India are unintended and about a third result in abortion. Only 22% of abortion are done through public and private health facilities. Most of it are just done illegally. Lack of access to safe abortion clinics, particularly in public hospitals, the stigma and the attitude towards women, especially young unmarried women seeking abortion, contributed to this, and it continues to this day. Now, doctors also refuse to perform abortions on young women or demand that they get consent from either their parents or spouses, despite no such requirement is needed by law. This forces many women to turn to often unsafe abortions. Actually, per law, we have something called the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act of 1971, which provides termination only up to 20 weeks. If an unwanted pregnancy has proceeded beyond 20 weeks, women have to approach a medical board and courts and seek permission for termination, which is extremely difficult and cumbersome. The law does not accommodate non-medical concerns about the economic cost of raising a child or poverty or anything like that. Effects on career decisions, etc., are not taken into consideration whatsoever. Though sex selective abortions are illegal, India has a growing case of female feticide and girl children femicide, where though there are strict laws against it, families have found a way to pay money or something like that and find the sex of the child, and then they kill it. Or if the child is born within a day or two, there are these places that you can go to if you're in a rural part of India, where there's this old woman who can just give the child some poison and the child is dead because it is a female child. And immediately after that, the mother is made pregnant, hoping that there will be a male child this time. Of course, several women's groups have worked tirelessly to bring this light and the dangers of lack of medical termination and continue to raise voices, but things continue to remain grim at the moment. Now, what right to inheritance? 5 Indian states, sometime between 1970 and 1990, they amended the Hindu Succession Act 1956 to allow equal inheritance rights for women and men. And in 2005, the central government mandated equal inheritance. And this is when all other states implemented the reform, because these 5 states sort of set the precedence. For Muslim women, the laws are a little different according to the Sharia law. The Indian Succession Act of 1925 governs the inheritance and succession laws applicable to Parsis, Christians, and Jews sort of relied upon that. However, there are several groups that are, probably far away, far removed from civilization, and in some sort of a terrain like the Himalayas or something like that. They continue to fight for their rights of inheritance because of patriarchal nature of preference of male children and how the property needs to be passed on to the male child, because the girl is considered to be a liability where she will be married off and will leave to go to another family. Therefore, she was not considered important enough to have any share in the family property. Again, the right of inheritance of female agrarian or homestead land, where farmers are fighting for right now, is a completely different issue. That's not an inheritance based on familial passover. This is something else, where if you're working in a farm for a certain amount of time, there are some provisions where men could have access to that land in a form of partial ownership or something like that, but none of that is applicable to women, even if they are the ones that are working tirelessly in it. But that's a subject that we have to go in deep about some other time, because that's a topic in itself. Now, obviously, women understood the importance of education as a way of empowerment very, very early on. For centuries, women were considered to be inferior. They were constrained in the 4 walls of the house or the kitchen, and the education was reserved for the upper caste men. The work of these educators and activists formed the backbone for a more equitable world for women and girls. A wider prevalence of women's education didn't just mean more women being educated, but it meant women entering the public sphere. It paved a way for women to be leaders, women in science, and a life of independence and dignity for them. There's several women who have worked their entire life, I'm not even exaggerating, who have worked to make sure such a thing is possible, where little girls have access to education. But the work of one woman requires a special mention, Savitribai Phule, who is known as the first female teacher in the first ever school for girls built in India. Along with her husband, Jyotirao Phule, she worked throughout her life for the dignity of the life of oppressed caste people and women. Along with Fatima Sheikh, who was also considered to be a first Muslim teacher, they started the first ever school for girls in 1948 in Pune. By 1951, they had 3 similar schools running in Pune. They established an educational society where with the help of the established schools already, they could go ahead and talk more in detail about the need for such a system where empowered girls are able to then educate their parents. Therefore, that brings in more revenue to the family. The farmers who are otherwise not educated are now able to learn to do basic arithmetic, which means they can't be fooled or exploited by the vicious landowners or later during the colonial time by the British people, etc. So she went around and explained how educating one girl child is empowering the entire family. Now, apart from her, I would also like to just name a few of these women who you see on the right. Fatima Sheikh is the one that I mentioned. There is also Pandita Ramabai, there is Anutai Wag, there is Abala Bose, Kamini Roy, Ramabai Ranade, Chandraprabha Saikani, Tarabai Shinde, and Sarla Devi. These are all just some of the women, but this is just to give you a sense of how much work has gone in and how much these women have toiled their entire life to make sure a girl's education has been made possible. Although I must add a caveat that though they spend their entire life doing it, the reality in India, even today, is very, very grim, where children's education are not taken as a priority. So another thing that I thought I couldn't discuss, but I wanted to mention was about the women's rights to work. Given that the early women laborers were mostly from the unorganized sector, the topic too is very vast. Women's movement regarding right to work is a topic in itself, where women fought for the rights of maternity rights, they streamlined work hours, they worked towards prevention of sexual harassment, they worked on pensions, they worked on unionizations, etc. I have done several vlogs on my channel concerning workers' rights, women as workers, and right of women laborers, and so much more. That's my vlog if you want to have a look at it. Now, in conclusion, I will leave you with a few other untouched, uncovered women's rights movements that even Indians don't know or care about. India's northeastern states and women's agitation protests over there about custodial rapes, trafficking, army rapes, border disputes, and every other misogynistic practices that the rest of the country faces requires a special discussion in itself. But this is one of the very important aspects that we need to consider when you're talking about historic movements. Though it's declared unconstitutional, India practices the caste system, a social hierarchy that places Indians born to a certain caste to be subjected to unspeakable violence. Women from said caste face double discrimination in the form of caste as well as sex-based violence. About 10 Dalit women in India are raped per day. There's obviously also women belonging to religious minorities who are fighting for their rights. There is something called the Citizenship Amendment Act, which was passed by the current BJP government, which was challenged by several uprisings nationwide, and the women have been at the forefront of it. Muslim women of India have also long resisted misogynistic practices imposed upon them by the Sharia law. Unfortunately, due to the communal tensions, the voices of Muslim women have always drowned out. Women have spoken against triple talaq, or forced hijab on some instance, or resisting a religiously motivated banning of hijab in schools in some instances, etc. But their movement within the historic rights of women, women's movement, is very, very relevant as well. We also have women who actively participate in the safeguarding of environment, obviously, because women are concerned about nature more than anything else. Women have been at the forefront of safeguarding natural resources, and large group of protesters have gathered to prevent deforestation, building of illegal mines that would destroy both the ecology as well as the lives of families living around there. So women have been at the forefront of it. And while all this has been happening, things are still very grim. Women, though we have this glorious, glorious history of women's rights movement in India, things right now have taken a sudden turn to something entirely different. If I can leave you with the last slide in conclusion, so you can consume what's written on the screen. We are now working on how to make women men, how to make men women, how to remove gender, how to give girls chest binders, how BDSM culture can make more women assertive in work. And we also talk about first Indian transgender mother. And then, of course, on the left side, there is this man who talks about how he needed to use sanitary napkins because he was bleeding for 2 weeks after his vaginoplasty. Although in his Instagram post, he makes a poignant point about 23 million girls dropping out of schools because of period poverty. I just wonder if he went and asked their pronouns. I wonder how he otherwise knows that they are girls. I often get asked if there are actual women's organizations that are exclusively for women anymore left in India. but it's very hard to talk about because all the grassroots organizations which were at one point talking about anti-caste movements, the women that are suffering within the caste system, have all gone woke. So if you really think about it, what you thought was a grassroots movement has also been hijacked by gender ideology. So what's left are just actual women who just organizing privately, not under the name of an organization, not with a website, not anything else, are out on the street campaigning for real things, are the only women's organizations that are left which actually think of women's sex-based rights.